people in the kind of 30 to 45 age group emerging in politics, and of course David Cameron's part of that. The Prime Minister now taking his seat on the front bench, ready for Prime Minister's questions. Again, it will be interesting to see whether he himself broaches the subject or whether he simply says, I've had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others, and he waits for the subject of David Blunkett to be brought up. I think, again, thinking about past form of what happened in the case of Peter Mandelson was that the Prime Minister did himself bring up the matter and did speak about it.
And what does another man who's already left his job, the Leader of the Opposition, do today? Crow or move on to other things?
Well, see, Michael Howard has played a very interesting role ever since this whole hullabaloo about David Blunkett blew up, that he said absolutely nothing.
Yeah.
He has simply left it to Chris Grayling, who has been very measured but not a very well-known figure, a brief intervention by Malcolm Rifkind. But I think this is part of the Conservative calculation that with the leadership contest underway, that they didn't want to be seen to be negative or nasty or pushing David Blunkett out of the door because there was an element of public sympathy, and Michael Howard has just kept out of it altogether, which is quite remarkable in a sense, because he certainly felt the lash the other way in the dying years of the Major government and the so-called Tory sleaze era.
Yeah, just seeing that David Cameron has said it was the right thing to do in a statement earlier, so they have spoken, but we're just waiting, the time ticking on. How long to go? About a minute or so.
But again, you see, that's interesting. The leadership candidates have not made a great issue of this. Again, they've tried to concentrate on their own policy arguments. Speaking to David Davis in this studio on Sunday, he said, if there's been a breach of the ministerial rules, then I think David Blunkett should resign. David Cameron stayed out of it, and again, those comments which he made about David Blunkett were preceded by expressions of personal sympathy. There has not been, in spite of what we may hear from possibly Tony Blair or David Blunkett, in my assessment, there has not been a bloodlust and a hue and cry about driving David Blunkett out of office, which on some occasions, and one thinks possibly of Peter Mandelson, there has been. I mean, there's not been, I haven't detected either in the media or amongst politicians a great appetite to see David Blunkett brought down.
You're watching Sky News. It is 12 noon. We're in standby mode for the start of Prime Minister's Question Time. An extraordinary session this will be because the Prime Minister's lost a good friend and one of his Secretaries of State from his government, a man he brought back after the general election, David Blunkett, resigning this morning, telling the Prime Minister he thought his position was untenable. We will hear from David Blunkett within the hour. It's anticipated that a press conference is going to be staged at his outgoing Department of Work and Pensions. That's timetabled for 12:30, but may of course slip a little while. So we'll hear from Mr. Blunkett himself within the next half hour or so. We are now, any moment, going to hear from the Prime Minister as he faces the regular session of Prime Minister's questions. And once this particular set of questions and answers from the Minister has been given, we would expect, Mr. Speaker, to call the Prime Minister to the dispatch box.
Purchase number one, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, sir, before listening my engagement, the House will know that my Right Honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, has resigned. I would like to say that whatever mistakes my Right Honourable friend has made, I've always believed and believe now that he's a decent and honourable man who has contributed a great deal to his country, who has overcome immense challenges that frankly would have daunted the rest of us, and he can be proud of his record in British public life. Mr. Speaker, I also know the House and the whole House will join with me in sending our condolences to the family of the British soldier killed in Afghanistan at the weekend. He was doing a vital and important job, and his country can be very proud of him. This morning, I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in the House, I have further such meetings later today.
Ken Purchase.
Well, that's the Prime Minister's official engagements at the end there, and this is Ken Purchase, a Labour MP.
With the views expressed by my Right Honourable friend, the Prime Minister. Will my Right Honourable friend, the Prime Minister, accept that he speaks for all when he condemns the appalling, dreadful statement of the Iranian President in expressing his wish that Israel should be wiped off the map? A truly disgraceful statement. Will he also accept that his further remarks at Hampton Court over the weekend carried an implicit threat of military action against Iran. Does he share my view that the people of this country are in no mood for a military adventure in Iran? And if he does share that view, will he explain his remarks at Hampton Court?
I'm very happy to say, first of all, I did not talk either explicitly or implicitly about a military threat to Iran, but what I did say was this, that Iran has to realize that the international community cannot tolerate continuing conduct that is supporting terrorism around the world, frankly, that is supporting terrorism not just in the Middle East, but elsewhere, that is in breach of its nuclear weapons responsibilities and obligations under the Atomic Energy Authority. And I did want to make it clear, and I do make it clear again now, the statements by the Iranian president in respect of Israel are completely and totally unacceptable. So obviously, as I made clear at the press conference, this is something we want to discuss with other allies and with other members of the Security Council. Nobody is talking about military threats or invasion of Iran or any of the rest of it. What we are, however, saying is that the Iranian government has got to understand that the international community simply will not put up with their continued breach of the proper and normal standards of behavior we expect from a member of the United Nations. And I think the most important thing at the moment is that that is a unified message that goes out not just from this House and this country, but right across the world.
Michael Howard and the People of the Opposition.
I join the Prime Minister, Mr. Speaker, in expressing our sympathy and condolences to the family of the British serviceman who lost his life in Afghanistan over the weekend. This has been an extraordinary week for the government and for the Prime Minister. We have seen the slow seepage of his authority turn into a hemorrhage. We all acknowledge the honourable way in which the Secretary of State for Work and Pensions has decided to resign, and I pay tribute to him for that. But the key question now is for the Prime Minister. Does the Prime Minister think that in his handling of this affair, his judgment has been at fault in any way?
Well, let me tell him exactly why I did not believe that the allegations made against my right honourable friend warranted his dismissal. And perhaps with the frenzy that is going on around this, it's just as well for the House and for members of the public just to explain why not. There were basically three sets of allegations, and perhaps I can just be allowed to detail my reasons why I decided not to dismiss them. There were three sets of allegations. One was that he had not sought the advice of the Independent Advisory Committee, which he should have done. That is a breach of the ministerial code, it is true. I did not believe that it warranted dismissal for these reasons. First of all, I could discover no impropriety or wrongdoing in his doing that. Secondly, he had actually registered these things. He had registered these jobs with the Register of Members' Interests. It arose out of a misunderstanding on the correspondence, which I looked at myself and believed was an honest misunderstanding on his part. And it was clear to me that even had he been in touch with the advisory committee, as he accepts he should have done, the most that would have happened is that in respect of one of those jobs, his taking up of that job would have been delayed by a few weeks. In those circumstances, I did not believe it warranted his dismissal. The second set of allegations was in respect of the register of shareholdings in DNA Bioscience. He was supposed to follow a particular procedure for ministers when they come into government. He followed that procedure completely. Therefore, I could find no breach of the ministerial code in respect of that. The third and most serious allegations that were made by the shadow leader of the House was that he had had discussions whilst a member of the government and made representations on behalf of this firm that was either had a contract or was trying to get a contract from the Department of Work and Pensions. Had that allegation been true, it most certainly would have been a dismissible offence. I looked into that allegation. I found it to be completely untrue, and therefore it would not have been right in these circumstances for him to resign. That is why I did not dismiss him under the ministerial code.
Michael Howard.
Well, the Secretary of State has resigned, and I don't intend to pursue those matters this afternoon. And I quite understand why the Prime Minister's judgment in these last few days has been awry. I can entirely sympathise with his desire to cling on to the Right Honourable Gentleman, the member for Sheffield Brightside. Isn't it a fact that he was one of the Prime Minister's last remaining allies in the Cabinet?
My right honourable friend resigned for the reasons that he gave, that it became impossible for him, frankly, with the frenzy surrounding him and his job, for him to carry on doing that job properly. The reason I outlined to him the specific allegations is that I think, in fairness to him, people should understand that a lot of what has been written about him in the past few days has, on my investigation of the facts, turned out to be completely untrue. However, having said that, for the reasons that he's given, he has resigned. But I would just simply put to the House, that sometimes in these occasions, the degree of pressure to which people are subject is absolutely extraordinary, and I think we should just occasionally reflect on that, and when it's from somebody that has done an immense amount for this country, I think as he goes from government, we should say he goes, in my view, with no stain of impropriety against him whatever.
If the Prime Minister recalled some of the words he'd used when he was in opposition, he might have found it rather difficult to repeat the words he's just uttered today. The Prime Minister didn't answer the question which I put to him, and I shall resist the temptation to ask him to name his remaining allies in Cabinet. The truth is, Mr. Speaker, that this Prime Minister has not only lost his allies, but he's lost his authority. Let's look at some examples. Last week, the Education Secretary was squabbling with the Deputy Prime Minister on school reforms. The Health Secretary and the Culture Secretary were at loggerheads with the Defence Secretary over the ban on smoking. And this week, the Prime Minister is at odds with everyone else over his proposal to ban drinking on public transport at the very moment that he's introducing 24-hour drinking in our pubs. What's happened to the Prime Minister's authority?
Well, so we deal with each one of those. Schools. Yes, we are in favour, not just of investing in schools, but reforming them. We have a programme that we will carry through, and yes, we have a programme that we will carry through because this party believes in improving the quality of schooling in our country. We will do that, and we will carry it through. In respect of the so-called proposal for banning drinking on public transport, this was a proposal put to me that, incidentally, I'd already indicated we should not accept. However, as often happens in these situations, when it is then put in the newspapers and we point out that it's not accepted, it's then a U-turn. Leave that to one side. Over the next few months, we will be not merely carrying through the programme on schools, but also, in respect to the reforms in the health service, there will be new proposals, yes, on antisocial behaviour and crime, and today, of course, we have a very important debate on terrorism. Each of these proposals will be carried through because we believe in them, we believe they are right for the country, and at least we have a programme that we're carrying through.
Michael Howard,
doesn't the Prime Minister see, doesn't he really see that this week marks the beginning of the final chapter of his administration? Will he be the last person to recognise that with the departure of this key ally, there is no longer any doubt that the sole source of authority in his cabinet is the Chancellor of the Exchequer? For how long will this country have to put up with this lame duck Prime Minister in office but not in power?
We shall just see over the next few months exactly what happens, both in respect of the programme that has delivered us the strongest economy this country has had for years, in respect of a programme that has delivered us the best school results at primary school level, at GCSE, at A-level, a programme that is delivering us the biggest falls in waiting that this country has had for the National Health Service for 20 years, that is allowing us to increase the numbers of police and ensure that crime falls. That is the record upon which this government will be judged. It is a record that we can be proud of, and it stands in stark contrast to his record when he was in government.
Bob Blizzard.
Bob Blizzard, Labour MP.
Government looks set to reduce waiting times in the National Health Service to no more than 6 months by the end of the year. But is my right honourable friend aware that John Petrie, an orthopaedic surgeon in my local hospital, the James Paget, now has no waiting list at all since he introduced a dual system of operating with 2 theatres and 2 teams instead of waiting himself for the next patient? Is this not an example to be followed and commended? And would my right honourable friend meet with John Petrie to discuss how this innovation can benefit the whole of the National Health Service?
I'd be very happy to do that. And of course, that is a picture, if we're talking about policy, that is replicated right around the country. When this party came to power, we had people waiting over 18 months for their operations. We had tens of thousands of people waiting over a year. We are now, for December, going to have a 6-month maximum wait. That has brought the waiting list down very, very greatly indeed. As my honourable friend says, there are now parts of the country where we're virtually getting rid of waiting altogether. And within the next 3 years, by 2008, we will have an 18-week maximum wait from the door of the GP to the door of the operating theatre. That will effectively get rid of NHS waiting lists that we inherited after years of that party in government, and we will be getting rid of. And frankly, when all the rest of it is said and done, that is what matters to the people of this country.
Charles Kennedy, the Democrats.
Mr. Speaker, on behalf of my honourable and right honourable friends, can I very much share the sentiments so properly expressed by the Prime Minister at the beginning as to the loss of life of the British servicemen in Afghanistan over these past few days. Now, coming back to the issue of today and what the Prime Minister has been saying about the Ministerial Code of Conduct, does he agree that it does surely seem rather absurd that a minister or an ex-minister is obliged to seek advice but is not actually obliged then to take that advice? As a result of this experience, is the Prime Minister and with him the Cabinet Secretary actually urgently addressing that issue?
I think it's now pretty clear, if it wasn't before, that ministers are expected when they leave office to take the advice of the Independent Advisory Committee. And obviously that's got to be made clear. It certainly is fairly clear now, I would say.
Charles Kennedy. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister is ignoring the fact that they can seek advice and then not take advice. That is a ridiculous state of affairs for an apparent ministerial code of conduct. But can I ask the Prime Minister a further question? It was well reported recently, Mr. Speaker, that the now former Secretary of State for the Department of Work and Pensions and the Prime Minister disagreed over incapacity benefit reform. Can we have an assurance, whoever is going to occupy this Office of State later today, that the number 10 machine will not seek to impose their will on that Secretary of State where the reform of incapacity benefit is concerned? Because that is what people out there actually care about.
Well, again, when we actually get back to policy, let me just tell the right honourable gentleman, the Liberal Democrats now oppose every single reform, whether in the public services or for welfare. It is absurd to say that incapacity benefit that is now costing £13 billion a year, where we've got 3 million people economically inactive in this country, doesn't need reform. It does need reform. This side has got the courage to do it, and as ever, when it comes to a policy decision, the Liberal Democrats lack that courage.
Paul Farrelly, Labour MP.
Will the Prime Minister join me in congratulating schools in my constituency, Newcastle-under-Lyme, on the genuine increase in standards which they've achieved since 1997? They're too eager, Mr. Speaker. Would my right honourable friend recognise, however, that up to 1997, we spent years fighting the Tories' policy of offering unfair financial inducements to schools to opt out of local authority control? Would he give this House an assurance, therefore, that in any future education reforms, the government will not offer, directly or indirectly, any unfair financial incentives to schools to opt out of local authority provision, nor to any outside organisations such as private companies or trusts.
Order. The honourable member's got to be quicker. Got to be a bit fast.
I can assure my honourable friend that there will be fair funding for schools and no return to unfair funding, and in particular, and this is the major point of difference with the Conservatives have said that they want a free-for-all on admissions. I emphatically disagree with that. We should not have a return to selection aged 11. That will do damage to the children of this country and their future prospects. However, what we will do is empower schools to become self-governing trusts if they wish to do so, and enable them to have outside partners. We've already done this in respect of specialist schools and city academies. That has been highly successful. We need now to take it to a new level. But this will be a situation in which, alongside the investment, there will be reform, but it will be based on reform designed for equity and fairness, not a return to the unfair policies of the party opposite.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Conclude, Leader of Plaid Cymru.
Since New Labour came to power in 1997, the government have created 700 new criminal offences. Could I ask the Right Honourable Gentleman if you'd help the House by putting in a monthly aid memoir in the library so that we know how many offences have been created each month? And can I say it is rather urgent, bearing in mind the rather exotic jurisprudence within the present terrorism bill?
Well, I'll tell him exactly why we're legislating on things like antisocial behaviour, because at least on this side of the House we believe that's a crucial issue for people and they want protection in their local communities. And the fact that the Honourable Gentleman and his party opposes these measures says a lot more about them than it does when we are trying to help people in this country who are fed up with hooligans making their life hell in their local communities, drug dealers living in the same street, people being drunk and disorderly, and little the police can do. And we will continue legislating on these issues because it's the right thing to do to protect people in this country. And as for terrorism, let me just say this to the Honourable Gentleman. Each member of this House is going to have to take a decision on the terrorism legislation later today. But I want to let me just say to Conservative members, we need to be very, very clear as to why we are legislating to strengthen anti-terrorist laws in this country. We're doing it because the police, the head of the anti-terrorist operations in this country, say they need these powers to protect British citizens. Now, of all the things that we should debate today, that is important to the lives of people in this country. And I want to make it quite clear, so far as we are concerned, we will do our best to protect people in this country, and I think honourable members like him should think very carefully before they vote against the express desire of the Chief of the Metropolitan Police, the head of the anti-terrorist operations, and the people charged with protecting our country.
The vote on the time people can be held in custody will happen later on tonight in the House of Commons.
While driving carelessly now go to prison rather than face a paltry fine. Following some tragic accident fatalities in my area, can the PM assure me that the road safety bill will at long last force the courts to take these devastating deaths, these avoidable deaths on our roads seriously?
It's worth just pointing out, and I know this is a campaign my honourable friend has been leading with very great distinction, but last year more than 13,000 fewer people were killed and seriously injured on our roads compared to the average for 1994 to 98. So it's obvious there are gains being made by the strengthening of the law, and following a public consultation earlier this year, new measures are being introduced to strengthen the framework of offences to deal with bad driving and to help create safer roads for everyone. Now, we will try to take these measures forward through amendments to the Road Safety Bill, but I entirely understand what my honourable friend says, and it is interesting at the effect, which is massive. If there were any other area of public life in which such an effect were happening, people would take account of it in making the decisions they do. And that's why it's important we get these amendments right, and I'm sure we will.
Sir Peter Tapsell.
Sir Peter Tapsell, Conservative.
Speak for England. Why does he think that it is so widely felt that his presidency of the European Union has been a failure?
I would have thought he'd be rejoicing at that. That would be a feather in my cap if I managed to fail. We haven't completed the European presidency yet. The European presidency it's a 6-month period. We're at month 4. We then have the December summit. After the December summit, perhaps we can make a judgment about the success of our presidency. But one thing I am very proud of is that we managed to open accession negotiations with Turkey and Croatia. And what I think that shows is that contrary to his views, which are that the European Union is a waste of time, that we shouldn't have such a thing, I actually think the fact that so many countries want to come into the European Union is an indication of, for all its difficulties, what a strong institution it is.
Sarah McCarthy-Fry.
Sarah McCarthy-Fry, Labour.
Despite the tough new regulations in the Fireworks Act, I'm still receiving numerous complaints about the misuse of fireworks. And there was a horrific incident at the weekend where a Yorkshire Terrier was killed by having a firework tied to its leg and ignited. Would my right honourable friend not agree that it is time to consider an outright ban on the sale of fireworks to the general public?
I think the most important thing, if I say to my honourable friend, is that we've introduced new legislation on this. We've created 3 new offences. I think we've got to wait and see what happens over this period, and then we can make a judgment about the legislation. But I think to ban the sale of fireworks altogether would be a step too far.
Adam Afriyie.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There continues to be widespread concern about the plight of the less well-off and most vulnerable in our society. When there are millions, when there are thousands of people who are worried about the clawback of money because of the failure of the tax and benefit system, does the Prime Minister believe in accountability? And if so, who does he hold responsible? And when will he hold them responsible?
He says, and it's quite correct, of course there are difficulties as there are with the payment of any benefit. But let's just be quite clear about this. It's as a result of the tax credits that we have literally millions of families in this country with an improvement in their standard of living. We have pensioners that have been lifted out of poverty as a result of the pension credit. We have...
I'm going to say, Mr. Luff, that there's a lot of shouting and your voice rises above all the shouting.
Conservative MP Peter Luff being told off by the Speaker.
We have, over the past 8 years, we've lifted 700,000 children out of poverty, 2 million pensioners out of acute hardship. That has partly been done as a result of the payment of tax credits. So he is absolutely right in saying we must do more, of course, to help the poor and disadvantaged in our country. But can I just point out to him something? When his government was in power, they froze They don't like to be reminded of what they did in government, for sure. Well, that's right, 8 years, and in 8 years, we've lifted 2 million pensioners out of acute hardship, and who put them there? And let me say to the honourable gentleman, in those 8 years, whilst we have been lifting those people out of poverty, every single measure has been opposed by his party. So I agree we need to do more for the poor and disadvantaged, but the only way they'll get more is to keep this government in office.
Barbara Keeley.
Barbara Keeley, Labour.
Salford is the 12th most deprived local authority area in the country. In the past, deprivation in our area has been reflected in the level of GCSE and other test results achieved. This year, Salford achieved an 8% increase in our GCSE results and a 5% increase in our Key Stage 3 English. Is my right honourable friend the Prime Minister satisfied with these results, and can he tell me how they can be continued?
Well, my honourable friend, of course, is absolutely right. Not merely has the Cambridge assessment confirmed the improvement in teaching, but it comes on top of the Ofsted report that confirmed exactly the same. The truth is that teaching is getting better, the results are getting better, and the reason they're getting better is that this government has invested in education and also changed the education system. And so whereas when we came to office, just over half of the 11-year-olds in this country were getting the right literacy and numeracy results, Now the figure is 3/4. And that, again, is the difference between a Labour government that cares about education and a Conservative government that, in the years before they came to power, actually cut funding per pupil.
Paul Burstow, a Liberal Democrat.
According to the Children's Society, every year 100,000 children run away from home. Many turn to rough sleeping. Many turn to crime, drug taking, alcohol abuse and prostitution. Many are hurt and harmed as a consequence of this. At the moment, there are just 7 refuge beds across the whole country to meet the massive need that represents. These beds will not be funded after March of next year. Government funding stops before they are evaluated. Will the Prime Minister look to stop the funding being cut next March so that they can be properly evaluated and so that we can have a proper network of safe accommodation for children who run away?
We have, of course, invested a large sum of money on this, and the Rough Sleepers Initiative has cut the numbers sleeping rough very, very considerably indeed. We'll continue to invest. We've obviously got to make sure it's in the right way that yields the result. I mean, he's quite right in drawing attention to the problem, but again, the only way that we will solve it is to continue with the policies that we've set out. I'm not aware of the particular issue that he's raising in respect to that. I will get back to him on the detail of it, but I have to say to him that there has been more money invested in social housing and in providing for people, particularly young people who might run away from home, than any government has done for years, and will continue doing that.
Burden. Speaker, my honourable friend will be aware that over 6 months have now passed since the collapse of MG Rover in my constituency, and can I ask him to do 2 things? Firstly, to recognise the real contribution which the task force which the government set up has made towards helping the region and beyond to tackle the effects of that closure. But secondly, to recognise that there is still a large number of people who are without jobs, mainly concentrated in the area around the plant, and that they still face real problems. Will he agree with me that the South West Birmingham area needs a major regeneration programme to not only help the MG Rover workers still without jobs to get back into work, but to regenerate the entire community?
First of all, I would like to pay tribute to my honourable friend for the work that he's done for his constituents and through the MG Rover Task Force, and to congratulate the members of that task force. The way that Advantage West Midlands, Birmingham City Council, the Learning and Skills Council and Job Centre Plus have pulled together has been remarkable and has had the result that he describes. Since I'm pleased to see that there's some 3,000 or more ex-MG Rover and supply chain workers now in new jobs. However, we need to do a lot more. And one of the things we will be doing, of course, is investing in the new Science and Technology Park, but we will be making sure as well that the programme of support we've given to those workers that we introduced when they were made redundant continues, and that we make sure that we're also putting the investment into Advantage West Midlands that allows them to attract new jobs for the future.
Paul Rowan. Prime Minister, you visited Rochdale on the 21st of April, and you gave your personal commitment then to the Manchester Metrolink, including the 3 lines of Rochdale and Oldham. Was that electioneering? If not, can you please tell us when we'll get a statement and what...
The honourable gentleman should find a way of phrasing his supplementaries. Margaret Moran.
Is my right honourable friend aware that the family courts are routinely exposing children to the risk of ongoing abuse and even death at the hands of violent parents? This is according to a new report by HM Inspectors Court Administration, which says that CAFCAS are putting at risk children by not assessing the risk of exposing them to parental contact orders with violent parents. Does he agree that we urgently need safety measures in the forthcoming Children and Adoption Bill to safeguard our children against such violence?
Well, MP's already starting to leave the chamber, not waiting for the answer.
First of all, can I say to my honourable friend that we of course are concerned by the findings of the Inspector of Court Administration report, that there is such a strong perception that the courts presume there has to be contact with both parents, the concerns about violence and children's safety can be overridden. We remain utterly committed to the principle that the welfare of the child should be paramount in the consideration of the courts. We recognise that more needs to be done to address domestic violence concerns, and therefore we'll look very carefully at any amendments in this area tabled to the Children and Adoption Bill.
Prime Minister's questions, and maybe a bit late.
The end of Prime Minister's questions on the day that the Work and Pensions Secretary, David Blunkett, has resigned. He left his department for the last time just a short time ago. He's on his way to the Foreign Press Association. We are expecting him to make a statement in about 10 minutes' time. When Prime Minister's questions began just over half an hour ago, Mr. Blair made a statement about his former colleague. This is what he had to say.
Know that my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, has resigned. I would like to say that whatever mistakes my right honourable friend has made, I've always believed and believe now that he's a decent and honourable man who has contributed a great deal to his country, who has overcome immense challenges that frankly would have daunted the rest of us, and he can be proud of his record in British public life.
Well, a man who knows one or two things about what might happen at number 10 Downing Street. Alistair Campbell joins us now live, as you can see. Mr. Campbell, thanks for joining us on Lunchtime Live. How surprised are you at the announcement?
I'm not surprised terribly. I'm sad about it because I think, as the Prime Minister just said, David Blunkett is not just a good politician but a very good man, and I think it's always sad when somebody like him is lost to top-flight politics in this way.
Do you think he resigned or do you think he was sacked?
Well, look, I've not been involved in the discussions about this, and so I'm not going to go down all the various conspiracy theories that I'm already being asked about. I'd simply say that David has obviously reached the judgment that his position was no longer tenable, that he couldn't see a way of staying in the government, and I respect that judgment.
It's just, we've just heard what the Prime Minister has been saying in the House of Commons. I'm sure you heard it too, and he talks about he leaves with no stain of impropriety against him whatsoever, and I could discover no impropriety or wrongdoing as far as Mr. Blunkett is concerned. You wonder, with comments like that, why he had to leave his job at all?
Because David has reached that judgment that, and I think, you know, sometimes these things are not just about one thing, that over time politicians can just detect within themselves this sense that maybe they're not being as effective as they used to be, in part because of the frenzies that they seem to be attracting to themselves. And I think David's reached that judgment, and I think it's to his credit that actually he's taken that judgment, if you like, in the broader interest of the Labour government.
You've known him a long time. To what extent do you acknowledge that he's not the politician that he was?
Well, look, I think people develop in all sorts of different ways, and I think, as the Prime Minister said in one of his answers to Michael Howard, that, you know, the pressures at that level of politics, they are pretty intense. I think they've become more intense in a funny sort of way because of the sort of media age that we now live in, and the sense that there's got to be, you know, a media that's really likes operating at this level of frenzy. But I thought the most interesting thing that came out of PMQs was the fact, and I think this is actually Tony Blair's strength, is he just sticks to the big strategic mission and issues that the government has to deal with. And so all this stuff from Michael Howard and some of the instant pundits that I've seen, that this is going to knock Blair off course, this is going to knock the government off course, I just don't buy it. I've been through lots and lots of these situations, as you said in your introduction, in the past. I know what happens, and I think what you'll find is that after a day or two, people will still feel very, very sad for David Blunkett, but the government will carry on doing the job it's got to do.
When will they give the new title away?
I beg your pardon?
When will we hear who the new Work and Pensions Secretary is?
Well, I'd have thought, you know, if you look at the way these things are normally handled, I'd have thought pretty soon. But again, I think, you know, this morning the Prime Minister will have had that to deal with, probably half a dozen other issues that he was having to deal with, and do PMQs, and you know, he'll now move on to sorting out a replacement, I would guess.
You don't agree then, from what you're saying, that this latest resignation and the arguments that we saw about smoking in the Cabinet, which seemed to divide the Cabinet just last week, in any way reflects on the Prime Minister?
I don't in any, you know, I saw Michael Howard saying, you know, in office, not in power. Trevor Kavanagh was out saying the beginning of the end. I mean, if I had £10 for every time I've heard that kind of thing, or this is Tony Blair's gravest crisis yet. I mean, every time there's a big sort of frenzy like this, it is always said. And my sense of Tony Blair, knowing him as well as I do, he will be very sad for David Blunkett, but he knows that he's got a big job to do as Prime Minister. That's taking the reform programme forward for the government and for the country, and that's what he'll do. And you know, I think you've always got to differentiate in these situations between what is happening inside this media bubble and the Westminster Village, if you like, and what's going on out in the public. Now, some people will think David Blunkett's a good thing, some people think it's a bad thing, most people will feel that it's sad that he's ended up in this situation, but I don't think it actually affects what I would call the fundamentals in British politics.
Do you not think that some people might be thinking in Sheffield and elsewhere this afternoon that this was a once great man, he was the Home Secretary, he had to resign because of the claims about his office being involved with fast-tracking passports for his baby's nanny and that sort of thing, and then he comes back in and within just a few weeks he's off again? Does that not reflect on the judgment of the Prime Minister?
There may be people who will say that. My point is I don't think it actually impinges upon the big political fundamentals. I thought it was interesting that when the Prime Minister went through some of those during question time, the Tories just kind of sit there because they haven't got an argument on policy. They've got this leadership contest going on at the moment. There's just become a sort of beauty contest about who can do the best PR, and David Cameron appears to be winning that. There's precious little strategic policy debate going on. And I think what you see is a government and a Prime Minister that has got a big agenda for the country and is just going to keep going with that. And, you know, I've been in Number 10 and you've been where you're sitting now in lots of situations where we've had this sort of conversation. And, you know, you can argue that as time goes on and the governments develop certain things attached to them, but I would argue that this is a strong government with a strong Prime Minister, a big agenda for the future, and it's going to be taken forward.
Yeah, but he does have this green paper on welfare reform that he has to publish quite soon. Yeah. He put that in what he thought was the capable hands of David Blunkett. He's dropped the ball. Now he has to find someone very quickly in order to get their head round that very, very complicated issue.
Yeah, well, the first thing to say is that if you're at the senior level of government, most senior ministers keep their heads around most issues as they're going through the government, particularly one as important as welfare reform. I think the Prime Minister will find fairly quickly somebody who will be able to stand in and do a perfectly good job. This is not the first time in this government's history, let alone the history of the country, that a Prime Minister has had to find quickly a minister to take on a difficult portfolio.
But he is, apart from being a Prime Minister, he's also a man. He's been at the top flight for a very long time now. Does there not come a time when he thinks, actually, I don't need this anymore?
Not so far as I've seen, because I think he is able, I think, unlike a lot of people who follow politics, he is able to differentiate between, if you like, the strategic and the tactical, between what is important for the long term and between kind of short-term frenzies that come in and come out of our political and media debate. So, look, he's like anybody else. He's like you or me. You have good days, you have bad days. And I'd expect that if I were to talk to him about it this morning, he'd put that in the kind of bad day category. By this afternoon, I can assure you he'll be focusing on what he needs to do to get the show back on track, to get the government facing the right direction again. And in a couple of days, you'll be talking about something else.
To what extent would you be surprised if it emerged later on today that he actually sacked Blunkett?
Well, look, you know, I am one of those people, call me old-fashioned, but when the Prime Minister says something in the House of Commons, I tend to believe him. When David Blunkett, who I understand is about to make a statement, let's just wait to see what he says. My sense of what's gone on is that David Blunkett reached the judgment that his position wasn't tenable, that he was attracting too many of these kind of frenzies to himself. He's taken the decision to go. David Blunkett is Labour to his bootstraps. He is a good, decent man, and he has taken that judgment, not just for himself, I believe, but also for the government and for the Labour Party. Final thought about Mr. Blunkett. Is he a broken man now? Well, look, David is a lovely guy, and he's got a lot of strengths, and he has a lot of friends, and those friends will stay around him and help him through what will be another difficult period in his life. But in a sense, I think the reason that people like David go into politics is because they believe things deeply about the state of the country, about the state of our society. They want to make things, improve things for the better. And David can at least look back on a political career and say, well, he's done a fair bit of that. OK, Mr. Campbell, thanks very much indeed for sparing the time to speak to us on Lunchtime Live. Thanks a lot. Still waiting for Mr. Blunkett to make his statement at the Foreign Press Association. As you can see, there's an awful lot of interest in what he will have to say. That should have happened a minute or so ago. We are waiting for him. As soon as he does arrive at that podium, we'll take it for you live here on Sky News Lunchtime Live. Meantime, let's go up to Sheffield and talk to a friend of Mr. Blunkett's, Tony Dams. Mr. Dams, thanks for joining us on Lunchtime Live this afternoon. How surprised are you at the announcement today?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that? There's a lot of traffic noise.
Absolutely, Mr. Dams. I'll try and speak up a little bit for you. I just wondered how surprised you were at the announcement that we have heard today that Mr. Blunkett will be leaving his position.
I am surprised and disappointed what's happened. I'm really disappointed and surprised because I think that the worst that this is a minor transgression, if you like, on the procedure, and I think David's really paid the ultimate price for that, really.
He told the Sheffield Star only yesterday that he wasn't going to resign. What do you think caused the change of heart overnight?
I've not spoken to David since today at all, and I think he's probably considered what he would think may be damaging the government's programme of work. He got a very big job to do in getting the pensions review and other things through, and I think David may well have taken the decision that the focusing on his private life may have been affecting that, and I think if he's done that, he's probably decided it's better to resign. I personally wish he hadn't. I was with him last Saturday at a meeting in Sheffield with tenants, and he continues to have overwhelming support in his constituency, and I think not only me and Labour Party members will be disappointed. I think that his constituents and the ordinary people of Brightside, the vast and overwhelming majority of those people, will also be disappointed.
What's happened to him, Mr. Dams, do you think, over the last few months? He does seem to be a different politician to what he was before.
David's a very strong character, and he's got a lot of Sheffield steel in him, and I think if it had just been a question of, on a personal level, toughing this out, David would have done that. But I think he will have looked at the bigger picture and decided that it's better for the government and better for the country that he steps aside and lets someone get on with the job of delivering the very important work he got to do. But he'll be very active in his constituency. He'll throw himself into his constituency work, which I know he enjoys very much. And as I say, he'll continue to have the support of the ordinary people of Brightside.
What exactly do you think will happen to him now, though, Mr. Dams? Obviously, he will take some time out to reflect on what's happened over the last 8 months or so, 10 months to his career. Then what will he do? He can't come back a third time, can he?
David will make his own mind up on what he does over the next couple of months, but I would think it would be it'd be very sensible to take a few weeks off, if you like, and think carefully what he does next. But what he will do, he'll continue to be active in the constituency, and David will have a lot of friends around him, and he'll not be short of advice, and I'm sure he'll think things through and make the right decision for himself.
Okay, thanks very much indeed for sparing the time, Mr. Dams. Appreciate it. Still waiting to hear from Mr. Blunkett, 5 minutes or so behind schedule. We certainly saw him leave the his old department of work and pensions in Whitehall just a short time ago. A really very short drive to the Foreign Press Association, which is where you're looking at these pictures being broadcast live from. We have our reporters and correspondents in the room, and we will be hoping to hear from Mr. Blunkett very shortly. That's him leaving. I think that was Whitehall just a short time ago when he was leaving his Department of Work and Pensions for the very last time. He had been expecting to publish a green paper on welfare reform over the next couple of weeks. That won't happen now. Who might do it instead? David Miliband's name is already in the frame. Let's speak to John Craig, who's down at Westminster for us. These are live pictures outside now, outside the Foreign Press Association, perhaps caught up in a little bit of traffic, but as you can see, there's a media scrum outside. He was very unhappy about the photographers yesterday as he left his Grace and Favour home. Perhaps just as unhappy with their presence today, but nevertheless he realises that he does need to make a statement to the waiting press, so he makes his way up those steps, no doubt. In fact, I'm sure that Sadie, his loyal Labrador, will be with him as well, makes his way inside, and we will be hearing from him very shortly. Indeed, perhaps he'll take a couple of moments to compose himself before heading towards that press briefing room inside. So that gives us just time to speak to John Craig, who is down in Downing Street. Hello to you, John. Surprised, not surprised?
Oh, no surprise whatsoever. I've
expected this, since we on Sky News broke the story about these questions about DNA bioscience exactly a week ago, last Wednesday. It was then that Chris Grayling, the shadow leader of the House, got a letter from Mr Blunkett, which he admitted he'd bought these shares and put them in trust for his 3 sons. Yes, Mr Blunkett left, it was actually Richmond House, which is just the bottom end of Downing Street, K. He's obviously on his way to the Foreign Press Association, which is just over that way, the other side of the Mall. Prime Minister's questions today, extraordinary, some of Mr Blair's answers to Michael Howard, particularly this claim that he's done nothing wrong, no impropriety. Well, you know, there was a pretty damning charge sheet yesterday. There was the Cabinet Secretary, there was the Chairman of the Committee on Standards in Public Life, there was Lord Mayhew, who chairs the Appointments Vetting Committee. Now we've heard today Lord Nolan, the original sleazebuster, also saying he'd broken the rules. Also, one point of detail, Mr Blair denied that Mr Blunkett had meetings with DNA Bioscience since he'd come back into government. Well, we do know that Mr Blunkett had dinner at Annabelle's nightclub in June with Tariq Siddiqui, whose family are involved in this company. That was on the occasion, of course, when Mr Siddiqui introduced him to Sally Anderson, the estate agent. So I think the aficionados and the conspiracy theorists will say there are still some unanswered questions. And so what's happening now, Prime Minister's questions are over. I'm told Mr Blair is spending the afternoon over at the House of Commons. He's obviously got the question of Mr Blunkett's successor to sort out. Another name, Kay, for you, John Hutton, experienced Minister of State, recently joined the Cabinet. I was talking over the road at Richmond House just now to a senior civil servant from the Department of Health. They share that building, the two departments, singing John Hutton's praises, saying very capable minister, much more experienced than David Miliband, who after all has only been an MP for 4 years, since 2001. Mr Blair is in the Commons. He's seeing the Chief Whip, Hilary Armstrong, other MPs, as he quite often does after PMQs, but he's got an urgent crisis to deal with this time. He's also planning to stay for the Commons debate, I'm told, on the prevention of the new anti-terrorism bill. It's the committee stage today, possibility of a big Labour rebellion on this question of glorifying terrorism, the 90-day internment without charge or trial of terrorist suspects. So for the moment, Mr Blair is over in the Commons trying to sort out this crisis, and it is a crisis. Mr Alistair Campbell may say the business of government goes on. Mr Blair focuses on the big picture. Well, this is a pretty big picture too. The third term welfare agenda is in chaos, it's in crisis, because the architect of that reform has gone in humiliation and disgrace, whatever the Prime Minister told MPs, and somebody has got to come in and sort out the mess.
OK, John, thanks very much indeed for now. We're expecting to hear from Mr Blunkett very, very shortly indeed, coming through that door within the next few seconds, we're told. Certainly, I think it's fair to say that his ministerial career is over, at least for now. The likelihood of him being able to come back a third time into a Labour government at the highest level is somewhat unlikely. He will definitely lose his grace and favour home, we're being told. He will keep his special branch protection, as the former Home Secretary is entitled to that. At least for now, it's up to Special Branch to decide when that will no longer be appropriate. And these are pictures of him arriving at the Foreign Press Association just a short time ago with his special advisors and press personnel in tow. He took a job without consulting an independent committee. That job was with DNA Bioscience Technology. The Prime Minister said he did absolutely nothing wrong. No stain of impropriety against him whatsoever, is what he told the House of Commons. I could discover no impropriety or wrongdoing. The mistakes arose out of an honest misunderstanding in the course of correspondence, is what the Prime Minister said. But it's also worth bearing in mind, of course, just a little bit more history for you. Back in December, he had to resign again, at that time as Home Secretary, over claims that his office fast-tracked a visa application for his lover's former nanny, I beg your pardon. David Bowden is outside the Foreign Press Association. He saw Mr Blunkett arrive. Hello to you, David. We are expecting to hear from Mr Blunkett in just a few seconds. Just talk us through what happened when he got there.
Well, bizarrely enough, knowing he was coming here, his car actually went all the way past and they had to turn round at the top of the road. and come back down. So we got a fairly good indication of his timing. He went in, you saw there was a huge media scrum on the steps here. Now I can tell you the room that you've been looking at that's set up for his statement is on the first floor here.
David, if I interrupt you for just a second, I'm very sorry to interrupt you. Let's hear from David Blunkett.
Well, good afternoon. Thank you very much indeed for joining me. I wish to put on record my thanks and appreciation, firstly to the Prime Minister for his enduring support, and to my own colleagues, family and friends, and I might say to the private officers of my departments over the last 8.5 years. I appreciate it greatly. I stepped down today precisely to protect the government from diversion from the policies that we're carrying out, from the reforms we're bringing in. And I don't think you need to be a genius to recognise that the events, not just of the last few days, but of the last few weeks, have certainly been a diversion from the real business of being able to report news. I'm proud of the free press we have in this country. I believe it's very important, and I think that the scrutiny of public office is crucial. I believe, therefore, it's incumbent on me to describe today precisely what has happened. There's no doubt that the cumulative effect of what has happened over weeks in terms of speculation about my private as well as my public life has affected the way in which people have come at the last few days. I have no grumbles about that, other than to say that the so-called revelations of Max Clifford are just those. They're complete lies, and one day, but obviously not now, they will be dealt with. What I am clear about is that I've made a mistake. I said so last weekend. Tony Blair at Prime Minister's Questions dealt with the three key issues. Should I have written to the advisory committee informing the chairman of the offices I intended to take outside government, the companies that I had an association with? And the answer is yes. The correspondence we had in March led me to believe that there was some confusion, and therefore that this committee was voluntary and not mandatory. I am clearly wrong about that, and it's a credit to the standards of public life now, with an advisory committee that didn't exist previously, with a register of members' interests that didn't exist previously, with the chairman and committee on standards in public life that didn't exist previously to 10 years ago, that we are able to scrutinise what ministers are doing, ex-ministers out of office and ministers in office. So let me deal with the 3 points. Was I at fault in not writing to the committee? Yes, I was. It was the same fault on 3 occasions, arising precisely from the same misunderstanding by me. And I have to take the consequences of that, which is why I'm stepping down today. Did I do anything wrong in buying a holding in DNA Biosciences? No, I didn't. Did I declare that holding when I came back into government? Yes, I did. Not only did I declare it in the required fashion, but I put it on my press release on May the 6th and on the website from the department. I don't think any other minister coming into government has ever done that before. And there are real issues for those, including the shadow leader of the House, who have made a great song and dance about this as to what will happen in future should there ever be, God forbid, an incoming Conservative government. Having investments and holding shares in modern Britain is not a crime. Declaring them is an imperative. And on the 3rd point, which was raised and Tony Blair dealt with at Prime Minister's Questions, let me say this. Not only had I declared that holding and those connections, but I ensured that there was a firewall between me and any decisions to be taken for the Child Support Agency in relation to DNA testing. The contract isn't due till 2008. On 4 occasions over the last 6 weeks, Christopher Grayling has challenged me in a Sunday newspaper by saying he was going to bring things to the House, to my attention, to the Register, to the Commission. He didn't. So I wrote to him 10 days ago and asked him to put on record, finally, what his accusations were. He did, and I replied to them a week ago. Those accusations were unfounded, as was the suggestion that I'd had dealings with and made representations on behalf of DNA Biosciences. So I am guilty of a mistake, and I am paying the price for it, and I make no bones about saying that that is my fault, and I stand by it. Let me just say this. I'm extremely proud of what I've been able to do over the last 8 years. In reforming the education system, the first ever universal nursery and childcare programme, the literacy and numeracy programme, the transformation of primary education, the introduction of citizenship, the work I did as Home Secretary in counter-terrorism, on antisocial behaviour, on the transformation of the police in terms of community beat officers and community support officers. And I'm proud of what I've done in the last 6 months in preparing the reform of the welfare state, the biggest, most comprehensive reform of the welfare state since the Second World War. And I'm proud of the work that I've been doing alongside the Commission in raising the issues of finding a solution to our retirement and a decent quality of life and income. I'm deeply sorry for the embarrassment that I've caused to the Prime Minister. As we saw at Prime Minister's questions today from Michael Howard, it is the Prime Minister that some people wish to target. I wish to support him. I wish him to continue carrying forward the modernisation and reform agenda. I'm proud of our government, and I hope in future not, of course, to return to government, but to play a part in public life in using the experience I've gained over 40 years as an elected representative to be able to improve and continue improving the life chances and the well-being of the people I serve. I'm very happy now to take questions. Thank you.
Nick Robinson, BBC News. Mr. Blunkett, are you telling people that nothing new emerged today or yesterday, that simply, if you like, you lost the will to fight this barrage of criticism? Can you also explain why yesterday, speaking to your local newspaper, you said, I've done nothing wrong, and today you say you made a mistake? And just finally, if I may, is it correct that you called the Prime Minister and you said, I want to go?
Well, you asked me 3 questions. Firstly, nothing has changed from the weekend. In fact, the only issue that I am acknowledging as a mistake, other than having met 1 or 2 people at a Conservative drinking club in London on 2 occasions, is this: that in not actually writing to the chairman of the committee, the advisory committee, I clearly had breached the ministerial code. When I say I've done nothing wrong, what I mean is that I've actually not in office taken any step, been involved in any discussions, had any talks, or misused my position in any way. And given that, quite rightly, journalists over the last 9 weeks have been delving into every aspect of my public and private life, I am quite able to say that everything that's been revealed has shown, with this one exception, that I have not committed any offence that would reduce Tony Blair's confidence in me as a minister. I congratulate Francis Elliott on doing that. I wish I'd spotted it earlier, and then I would have been able to tell the world that I'd made a mistake. On the final point, let me just make it clear. I called Downing Street at 8 o'clock this morning. I said it was right that I should go and see Tony Blair. Tony asked me to stay. It became clear when I came out of Downing Street, on the return to and when I was in Portcullis House, that that was not tenable. And so I went back to Downing Street and reluctantly told him that in the interests of the government, in clearing the decks, in ensuring that people know that whatever we've done, no matter what it is, if it is wrong, then we should step aside. And that is what I've done.
David, Tom Bradby from ITN. People are a little bit confused about what happened this morning.
I'm not surprised. Confused about the last few weeks, that's for sure.
Okay, but this morning you went towards that, you left Downing Street, you went to that committee, you then went back to Downing Street. Just before you went back to Downing Street, one of your aides was seen cursing and swearing on the telephone as if you'd been summoned back. Can you just explain? I mean, there is a theory that you didn't resign, you were pushed.
There was a bit of cursing and swearing because we'd found that the committee had disbanded, and I had every intention of fulfilling my obligation to them for the annual report, and to be scrutinied. It became very clear that that wasn't going to be the case, and I went back to tell Tony that on reflection I thought that there was going to be increasing damage done to the government by me, and none of us are big enough than the policies we've sought to carry out, the government that has supported us and put us in office, or the party that has worked with me and for me over the last 4 decades.
Mr. Blunkett, Andy Bell, 5 News. There are many people who say that it's really been the problems from your private life, going back to last summer, that have really, in the end, overwhelmed your political judgment and caused you all these difficulties. Is that an analysis you at least in part recognise?
I presume you mean 18 months ago, not this summer, because despite the coverage and the fabrication and fiction, including the film that appeared, none of that is true. I don't accept that I should reflect back on 18 months ago, and I make one appeal, and this is for my closest family and my friends and for those who were involved in that, because it was a personal tragedy 18 months ago. Please now, leave them alone. You may not be able to leave me alone. There was a posse outside every angle of my house for 16 hours yesterday, but I've got used to that. Over the last 9 weeks, there hasn't been a weekend when there hasn't been photographers around my homes. There hasn't been a single weekend when there hasn't been a barrage of questions and ridiculous innuendo and allegations, which we've patiently answered. I make no grumble. That is the free press we have. You will delve out whatever needs to be delved out. But please leave other people alone, and let us not go over and over and over a personal tragedy of mine. Please leave them alone.
Jenny Percival from Sky News. Can you tell us why you didn't resign immediately you realised you'd made a mistake, and in staying on, have you not hastened Mr. Blair's departure as Prime Minister and caused unnecessary damage to the government?
It could only have damaged the Prime Minister if I'd stayed on from today. The Prime Minister being strong in support of his Cabinet colleagues, the Prime Minister understanding that when somebody's made a mistake, but when there was considerable confusion in March, if you've read the correspondence of the 2nd and the 15th of March, you know there is, and that's acknowledged in the second half of the Cabinet Secretary's letter on Monday in terms of having to sort out that confusion, and nobody's going to be in any doubt for the future now. In standing by a colleague who'd made a mistake, I consider the Prime Minister to once again have enhanced his reputation for leadership. Capitulation to every accusation made against every colleague would result not just in this government, but in any future government having no one in their government at all that had committed even the slightest misdemeanour in their past or present life. I hope everyone will bear that in mind.
Mr. Blunkett, David Grossman from Newsnight. Can I ask, on reflection, do you think that perhaps you came back into government too soon, that there were still elements of your private life that needed to be tidied up before you came back to government?
Well, if tidying up one's private life is the prerequisite to undertaking properly one's public duties, then the answer would be yes. But despite the 3 efforts by Newsnight to smear my private life and myself, I'm happy to answer you openly, which is that what I had was precious to me and remains so. And I have no regrets about what happened years ago. I have regrets about the mistake of not writing to the advisory committee, but unless we understand that the private and the public are separate, we will destroy our democracy in Britain.
Trevor Kavanagh from The Sun. David, for your sake and for ours, could you clarify some of the confusing timelines involved this morning? We were under the impression that when the committee decided to adjourn the meeting this morning, it was for a half-hour adjournment only, not to cancel until sometime later. And therefore, could you tell us when you actually went to Downing Street in the first place, and what happened in that period that the chairman of the committee seemed to assume that it was first on and then off again?
Well, I'm happy to do so, Trevor. I thought that the issues were around Did I make a mistake in not writing to the advisory committee? Did I register and openly declare my interest with DNA? Did I have any dealings with the company or misuse my office since May the 6th? But if the issues are about what time did I ring, I'll happily, and what time did I go, I'll happily say so. I rang at about 8 o'clock this morning and indicated that I thought it was useful to come in and talk, given that the continuing froth that existed and was continuing to put pressure on the government, on the Prime Minister, and to cause great confusion and to wipe out the agenda of the rest of the news media. So it was arranged, and it was not possible for that to take place before 9:15. So I went and I talked to the Prime Minister. I sent a message that I would come to the committee, but it was quite likely I'd be a half an hour late. I went back to Portcullis House. By that time, it had become abundantly clear that the situation was such that if I was to protect and support the government and do what I wanted to do, which was to ensure that the Prime Minister knew that I would always put him and his government before my own personal needs, that I would have to go back and talk to him again. And I did, and I said, I think we've reached a position where my situation is untenable and I wish to step down. And I thanked him for his support.
Michael White from The Guardian. Mr. Blunkett, in all the speculation this morning as to why you might have changed your mind from yesterday, suggested that when you reviewed all your diary and the entries you made in the Register of Members' Interests, you might have forgotten a couple of dinners or lunches at which you spoke for a fee. We might as well clarify it now, it'll save the headlines. Secondly, you've been generous to the robust workings of a free press about your mistakes this morning. We all make mistakes. I wonder, over the 18 months since this drama began, whether you'd ever considered the possibility that one of the contributory factors to your downfall is that, though Home Secretary at the time, you might have been, on a day when we're voting on civil liberties, that you might have been the victim of an illegal wiretap at any time.
Well, on the first point, yes, the scrutiny of my life led me to review everything that I'd done, and that included the Register of Members' Interests. It has been a practice that people register within a month. Some of those things I hadn't registered within a month because it fell within the prorogued period. Incidentally, I ought to just make it absolutely clear that twice I tried to register within the prorogued period of Parliament, and twice I was told that I couldn't register because I was neither a Member of Parliament nor a Minister, and I have a record of that. Just so that there's no continuing doubt, so that no Sunday newspaper, particularly the one that's been onto my advisors as was since the 15th of May this year, so that they don't have to ring me up to ask me about it. So I registered everything, and that will come out in the written register. Pardon?
Phones, wiretaps?
Phones? Oh, who knows? On my walks in Derbyshire, I've even suspected at times that the birds in the trees were wired up.
Fraser Nelson from The Scotsman. Mr. Blunkett, now that you're no longer a minister, do you feel able to keep your shareholding in DNA now that there's no requirement for you to get rid of it? And secondly, do you intend to keep pursuing directorships in the private sector from now on?
Firstly, my sons and I will talk in a week or two's time about what we do, because obviously the trustees, because these are not my shares anymore, the trustees have said to me today that firstly they want to be left alone because they have actually been harassed by only one or two of your lesser scrupulous colleagues. Secondly, my sons need to think what they need to do in the light of the fact that I am no longer a Cabinet Minister. And thirdly, I will reflect on what I do in terms of my future and the contribution I can make publicly and privately, but make no mistake about it. I will be writing to the advisory committee. I will make sure that I register it. And if you like, I'll put it on a website just to save one or two of the Sunday newspapers the bother of setting several people onto me during the course of the previous week.
Andrew Sparrow from the Daily Telegraph. Two questions. Just to clarify what you said in your last answer, does that mean there are interests that that aren't in the public domain yet that will be disclosed? Well, and did they have any bearing on your decision today?
No, not at all. I'm not entirely sure what is in the public domain. There's certainly quite a lot of the things that I've registered that are not in the public domain, despite the scrutiny. I'm grateful to all of you for not having actually printed blow by blow everything that I did while I was out of office, but everything I did while I was out of office is registered and will appear in the printed register.
And secondly, you talked about Max Clifford and the lies, and you said those would be dealt with at a future stage. Now you're out of government, do you intend to sue for libel?
Oh, I'm not going to go into that. I mean, there will come a point between now and Christmas when I'll genuinely be able to deal with my private affairs privately. I have great regrets about leaving government. The welfare reform agenda, what we're doing on pensions, Lord help me, even the chance to try and sort out the child support agency, were all enormous challenges which I've taken on with enthusiasm and vigour. But actually the only thing I will not regret is actually not having those phone calls on a Saturday and the newspapers on a Sunday, unless it is that someone knows something that I don't.
Mr. Blunkett, it just seems from your description, you're saying you actually decided to resign after your meeting with the Prime Minister, and as you were approaching the Select Committee and finding it was cancelled. It almost seems like you almost made a decision this morning at around 9:30 or so, and it wasn't something you'd thought on overnight, and you went to see the Prime Minister about it. Is that right?
I've been thinking of it since last week. I've been thinking of it since the phone calls, because actually two newspapers asked me exactly, word for word, the same question on Saturday afternoon from two different stables. But I answered the questions openly and honestly, and I've been thinking about it ever since. But the answer to your question is that when you've been in politics as long as I have, you can smell and feel when it is right to step away. And I felt that between Downing Street and Portcullis House.
From Sky News. Mr. Blunkett, isn't it only fair that Tony Blair does take, as you said, some of the heat, because he's the one who brought you back into the cabinet at a time it's now clear that you'd lost your sense of judgment?
It isn't. I'm not entirely sure what the sense of judgment is that you believe I'd lost in terms of the 6 months that I've been a cabinet minister. If anyone can actually test out that prognosis in terms of decisions I've taken over the last 6 months and the decisions I've made in terms of the reform agenda and the answers I've given in Parliament, then I'm very happy to answer for it.
Were you making basic mistakes, were you not?
No, I made a mistake, which I've admitted to. I'm terribly sorry, but one of the things about perception and froth is that one thing leads to another, so that even heavyweight broadsheet newspapers started to write that my department had had talks and negotiations with DNA Biosciences when no such talks and negotiations had taken place. Some had written that I'd actually been involved in not declaring and registering the interest with DNA Biosciences when it was on my press release. So I'm aware that not everybody reads everything, appreciates everything. I appreciate that, but I would appreciate now if actually we could get back to a sense of proportion and reality and address the world as it really is.
Ben Hall from the FT. The Department of Work and Pensions is about to get a fourth Secretary of State in a little over a year. Isn't this whole affair a massive disruption of what is one of the most fundamentally important areas of public policy?
Well, apart from what the damage has been done to colleagues and family and friends, it's the one thing I really regret, because I enjoyed this job enormously, a massive, important challenge for the future of our country. I hope I've led the team sufficiently well to have put in place the proposals and recommendations that will be announced between now and Christmas on welfare reform and on the Child Support Agency, and of course alongside the Commission on the issue of the future of income in retirement. I've got great confidence in the team, and whoever Tony Blair appoints to replace me will be able to lead them to carry out that agenda. And I hope to support it from the backbenches and in whatever role I can in public life in the future. Thank you very much.
The final statement from the former Work and Pensions Secretary as he leaves the Foreign Press Association. He'll be gathering his belongings and then probably, as you were saying, heading back up to Sheffield to spend a couple of weeks or so with his sons before he decides what to do next. Listening to that for us was Alistair Campbell and also our political editor, Adam Bolton. Mr. Campbell, to you first again, if I may. He says he was guilty of a mistake. We all make mistakes. Should he have resigned if he was guilty of one mistake?
Well, he's decided to resign for the reasons that he's given, and I think probably the most interesting point that I would take out of that was what he talked about, the cumulative effect, and I guess that is what has made him realise that it's probably time to go. And I mean, to be honest, I identified a little bit with the thing that he said about, you just reach within yourself that feeling that it's time to go, and I think that's what's happened with David, and the media will dance over every word for a day or two, and then I suspect we'll move on. I said to you before his statement that I felt very sad for him, and I do feel very sad, and that's been reinforced by watching that event. But I think that in relation to the reasons why he's gone, I mean, I don't think he's added that much to what was known before.
He says that private and public lives should be kept separate. Is that possible in a ministerial office that high?
It's very, very difficult, and but I think that a point that is just worth bearing, and when these things are going on, I mean, I think we do just have to every now and then take stock as to what sort of people we're going to get going into politics. When going into politics and being high profile in politics, you do have to, I mean, David gave some of the glimpses of what it's like just having the kind of, the sort of the levels of investigation into your life. Now, he's said that he made a mistake, and I think he's accepted that, and as a result of that, he's resigned. But actually, I think it is the cumulative effect of the way that sometimes moods just attach to certain people, certain politicians, and they find that it's impossible to do their job properly. And I think that's sad, because I think somebody like David Blunkett, I've known David for a very, very long time, and he's a good bloke. He's rooted in the Labour Party. He's got very good instincts. I think he knows where people's instincts are on some of the big issues that he's been trying to deal with, crime and terrorism, welfare reform, or what have you. But I think it's he's just reached that judgment, and I'm a friend of his, and I respect that.
Adam's at number 10 for us. Adam, to what extent, you heard what the journalists were asking there, to what extent do you think he did go to number 10 Downing Street and then he was on his way to Portcullis House and he changed his mind and decided that he did want to resign?
Well, we've had the versions on the record from both David Blunkett and the Prime Minister. Clearly there were two meetings this morning, and clearly at some point between the two, the meeting of the Select Committee was cancelled, and David Blunkett decided that his position was untenable. Now, we've got to accept the version of events which they've given, because frankly, if Tony Blair, and I'm not suggesting that he did, if he has given an untrue account of events in the House of Commons, then I think it wouldn't just be the Work and Pensions Secretary that would be talking about resigning. There are rumours that perhaps there was rather more pressure applied on David Blunkett than has been suggested, but that is not what either the Prime Minister in the House of Commons or what David Blunkett is saying. So for the time being, the only other people in on their meetings or their phone calls would have been officials, and we must and should indeed accept their version of events.
Mr. Campbell, we heard from Mr. Blunkett there. He says that if he had stayed on after today, he would have damaged the Prime Minister. Why would he say that?
Because it's what he thinks, and I don't think there's any great rocket science in that. I mean, he has just reached a judgment that he was damaging not just himself, but also the broader interests of the Labour government, with a very, very big agenda for change and reform to be taken forward. And I think it's interesting, actually. I remember when he resigned from the Home Office, he has got a very good relationship with the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister's got an awful lot of time for him, and I think it is to David's credit that he's just reached that judgment. And how these things happen, how people come to a judgment like that, it's complicated. But I think he's reached that judgment, and we've just got to respect that.
Adam, we heard him being asked whether he thought that he came back too soon. What do you think?
I think there's very little doubt he came back too soon. I think there's very little doubt that he was sorting things out in his personal life, both emotionally and indeed financially, clearly in that period between the two cabinet jobs, and clearly they did slop over into his work as a cabinet minister in his second stint following the election. I do feel that there's one element of this which is interesting, the comments he made about Max Clifford, and those of course also relate to his sometime alleged girlfriend Sally Anderson, who he met in Annabelle's, which he described as a Tory drinking club. I'm not sure is necessarily would accept that designation. Now, there will be questions asked as to what extent possibly there was entrapment involved with Mr. Blunkett in his relationship with Sally Anderson. Of course, she has given an account, been paid for account in newspapers, which is very different from Mr. Blunkett's version of events. Max Clifford is a man who has told me on air that he has no bones about embellishing a story if he thinks that makes it better. So perhaps we can see what David Blunkett was alluding to when he said that. Nonetheless, we do have to look at his behaviour. Rules were broken and there were a series of misjudgments. And as far as what he and Mr. Blair have both been saying, it seems to me it is true he put his business interest in the Register of Members' Interest, but he didn't follow the ministerial code on 3 occasions. The final point which he made in his defence, which he clearly appears very bitter about, the allegations or suggestions from Chris Grayling, the Conservative shadow leader of the House, that somehow he had continued having business links with the people involved in DNA bioscience once he became a cabinet minister. Both he and the Prime Minister have said those are untrue. I have not seen, I have to say, an account of what meetings he had with Tariq Siddiqui or others since he became a minister, what was discussed, or indeed what has it yet been explained why Mr. Blunkett, well into office, his image will continue to be used on publicity for the company. I think all those are things, questions which definitely would have been asked had he stayed in office. For now, though, he and the Prime Minister are giving him a clean bill of health on those.
Mr. Campbell, I wanted to ask you also about Max Clifford. Presumably you would, if you were advising Mr. Blunkett, you would tell him not even to consider suing him for libel.
Look, I'm not interested in Max Clifford, to be absolutely frank, and you know, this is what happens with these stories. They become like kind of, you know, little mini soap operas, and here's another little bit we can talk about, another bit we can talk about. I frankly don't want to talk about Max Clifford on a day that a serious political figure like David Blunkett has resigned. I think the important point today is that David has decided it's time for him to go. The Prime Minister is, as you saw from Prime Minister's questions, has got a big agenda for change for this country. Reform of the welfare system goes on, and he'll be busy now focusing upon that, making sure that the right person goes into that job now and takes that forward. And I think, you know, to be honest, we've just got to decide what sort of politics we want in this country, whether we do actually want our politics just governed. And Chris Grayling and people like that have got to decide this as well, whether it is just about, you know, trying to sort of keep these frenzies going for as long as possible, creating a politics of frenzy, or whether actually we do want to focus a little bit more on some of the bigger issues that really matter to the future of the country.
Okay, I want to ask you the same question, gentlemen, to finish, if I may, to you, Adam, first. What impact is this going to have on the Prime Minister, if anything? He's now looking for his 4th Secretary of State in a year, as far as work and pensions is concerned?
Well, I don't think, sound a bit like Alistair Campbell, I don't think we should necessarily hyperventilate on all this. The fact of the matter is that resignations by ministers are a fact of political life. They have happened before. I'm sure they will happen again under this Prime Minister and under subsequent ones. And that while it is absolutely acceptable that Michael Howard could try and make political capital out of this, say that political authority is seeping from the Prime Minister. I think probably that remains to be seen. My suspicion is if I was going to predict the fallout of that, there'll be a lot of questions asked in the media in the coming days over why did he resign if he didn't do anything wrong that was a resignation matter, according to both himself and the Prime Minister, and certainly some questions contrasting the Prime Minister's more lenient interpretation of the ministerial code up until today compared to what he was saying during and after the so-called years of Tory sleaze. I don't think we should get too high-minded about what's happened to Mr Blunkett and the Labour government, bearing in mind that what was sauce for the goose was certainly sauce for the gander in the latter days of John Major's government.
Alistair Campbell, are you breathing calmly or hyperventilating on behalf of the Prime Minister?
I tend not to hyperventilate if I can possibly help it, and I have seen a fair few, both under the last government and this one, of these sort of frenzies that come and go. And on Adam's goose and gander point, the big difference is that this government, unlike the last government, does have a big forward agenda for change and reform, and that is the most important thing. People there in the Commons today, you saw a Prime Minister who, whatever else is happening around him, just keeps going with the big agenda for reform and change for this country. And it's very, very sad for David that he's gone for the second time, just as it was sad when Ron Davis went, it was sad when Peter Mandelson went, and all the other big frenzies that we've had around this. But you've got a government and a Prime Minister, they've got an agenda for the country, they just keep taking it forward.
They probably need you back at number 10. Do you fancy it?
I beg your pardon?
They probably need you back at number 10. Do you fancy it?
They don't.
So that's a no then?
That's the no, yeah.
Okay, Alistair Campbell and also our political editor Adam Bilson, thanks very much. Let's go down to the Foreign Press Association again, and David Bowden is there. We were chatting to him very briefly just a short time ago. He's there again now. What happened when the former Work and Pension Secretary left, David?
Well, you may have noticed that as he came out, he didn't try and dodge what was a fairly substantial scrum. Let's not forget this was one of the big beasts of this government. He draws a crowd, and he drew one here. Big media scrum. He could have got straight in his car and zoomed off with his police escort. He didn't. He stood on the top of the steps, you can see there with a couple of people coming down now. Let the photographers get all the pictures they wanted. Then he got in his car and headed off, we think, back to the Department of Work and Pensions, because of course at some point he'll have to clear his desk.
Yeah, looking at those pictures as we speak to you actually, David, and presumably quite a lot of people to say goodbye to as well.
Well, that's right. This is a man who has a strong personal following. He makes very human bonds with people. He's seen as a man of the people, if you like, not so much a kind of high-minded politician, but somebody who understands the grassroots of this country, which is why, of course, he was so useful to Tony Blair and he wanted him back in government. And I suspect that they tried everything they could to try and smooth this over, but the media and, of course, the opposition simply wouldn't let this die. And David Blunkett decided, as we now know this morning, that enough was enough, and he would disappear off into the sunset. Will he be back? Well, of course, only time will tell, but I think most political commentators believe that at the very highest level, that's it for David Blunkett.
Okay, David Bowden, thanks very much indeed. 1:30. It's been quite a day, hasn't it? In the end, he went. On a dramatic day at Westminster, the Work and Pension Secretary finally resigned after the revelations about his business interests showed no signs of abating. It's the second time David Blunkett has quit the Cabinet within the past 12 months. This is a live shot at Richmond House, which is in Whitehall, returning again to Work and Pensions, this for the very last time, gone to clear his desk and say goodbye to his former colleagues. The official announcement came from a Downing Street spokesman just after 11 o'clock this morning. It said, David Blunkett came to see the Prime Minister this morning. The Prime Minister continued to express his full support for Mr Blunkett in his position, but Mr Blunkett said he had reflected on the position and he believed it was untenable. Mr Blair had reluctantly accepted the resignation. In the Commons today, the Prime Minister was full of praise for his former Cabinet colleague.
The House will know that my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, has resigned. I would like to say that whatever mistakes my right honourable friend has made, I've always believed and believe now that he's a decent and honourable man who has contributed a great deal to his country, who has overcome immense challenges that frankly would have daunted the rest of us, and he can be proud of his record in British public life.
That was the Prime Minister at PMQs at midday. Well, this is what Mr Blunkett had to say as he told journalists why he'd chosen to go.
So I am guilty of a mistake, and I am paying the price for it, and I make no bones about saying that that is my fault, and I stand by it. Let me just say this. I'm extremely proud of what I've been able to do over the last 8 years. In reforming the education system, the first ever universal nursery and childcare programme, the literacy and numeracy programme, the transformation of primary education, the introduction of citizenship. The work I did as Home Secretary in counter-terrorism, on antisocial behaviour, on the transformation of the police in terms of community beat and services. And I'm proud of what I've done in the last 6 months in preparing the reform of the welfare state, the biggest, most comprehensive reform of the welfare state since the Second World War.
Well, live now to Sheffield, and Mr Blunkett's agents, Harry Harpen, standing by. Hello, Mr Harpen. It's all over. What happened?
Well, David will take time to reflect. I think it's a bit too early at this moment to talk about exactly what's going to happen. I'm sure David will be very disappointed. He'll be sad. He'll be looking back at what's happened to him over the last 18 months or so and reflecting. But what I am convinced and know will happen, David will continue to work extremely hard to represent the people of Sheffield Brightside who elected him.
Yeah, but he told the local newspaper, the Sheffield Star, just yesterday that he wasn't going to resign, didn't he? And then he went to the Prime Minister and said he wasn't going to resign, and then he turned the car around less than half an hour later and did resign. What do you think happened?
I don't know. I haven't spoken to David. I've heard David make the statement that he went to see Tony Blair this morning. Tony Blair asked him to stay. David then drove away, and while he went away, he thought, and he did an extremely honourable thing, which is very typical of David. He thought, he reflected on the kind of harassment and hounding that he was getting from the press. He decided in a very honourable way, in my opinion, that this was had the potential to damage the government and the party, and David, as always, as ever, wasn't prepared to put his own personal career in front of the party and the government, and did the honourable thing, went back to see Tony Blair and offered his resignation very honourably.
He went back too soon, basically, didn't he? He had personal issues that he needed to resolve. He needed to sort those out. They hadn't been sorted out. He needed some sort of financial assistance. He started turning to these bioscience, DNA bioscience and that sort of company. He should have got his house in order before he went back to high public office.
Well, what David did while he went back into public office is he got a lot to offer. He was prepared, able, and Tony Blair wanted him to do a job. Tony Blair was confident that David would be able to do that job. If we're going to get into the realms of mixing the personalities, the personal life of David with his policies, it was because of David as a politician and what he can do that Tony Blair asked him to go back into government, and I don't think it was too soon at all. David's a very able politician, extremely able, a unique voice at the heart of government for the people that he represents, a good working class lad that took working class values and the working class voice to the heart of government, something that in my opinion we haven't got enough of. So I don't think he went back too soon. No, all this harassment and hounding of his personal life is completely out of order.
But no one disputes, I don't think, that he was a great politician. Even the Conservatives would concede that he was an extremely good politician. But he did have all of this personal stuff going on in his life, and that meant he took his eye off the ball, and look what's happened to him again.
I think that David's admitted that he's made the mistake. We all make mistakes, we're all human. It's a sad reflection of our society, I believe, that if everyone who is attracted to public life and goes to public office to do a job for the public, if every single one of those who makes a mistake has to pay the price that David has to pay, then I think we ought to reflect on that. We ought to think what kind of society we are, what kind of democracy we are, if a human being who's made a genuine mistake, and we all make mistakes, we're all human, if we have to have this kind of hounding, the harassment that not only David has, but I know that David's friends and family have had as well.
Yeah, but from your very own admission there, Mr. Huppen, he is a tough character. He's got where he is today, despite his background, despite the handicaps that he's had to overcome. And he made a mistake. Surely he was tougher skinned than thinking, okay, I've made a mistake and I can't cope with this pressure anymore, so I have to leave. So what's gone on?
Well, as I think that David said, I haven't spoken to David today. I've heard on him make a statement on the news. He felt that he'd made a mistake. He'd been open, transparent, acted with integrity in owning up to that mistake. What David felt was that the harassment and the hounding and the scrutiny of his public life, his private life, was beginning to become a story and beginning to potentially damage the government and the party, and that's something that David, as an individual, just was not prepared to put up with. As he said, nobody's bigger than the government, nobody's bigger than the party. What's important for the government is that we implement the policies that we were elected on in May, and David's reflected on that, I think, from what I've heard him say, and he's done a very honourable thing, which is no surprise from David. He's always acted with integrity and with honour. Yeah,
but those personal issues that you're talking about were there last December, which is why he resigned. They were still there now. They're still in place now. So why did he not, if he was such a consummate politician, why did he not realise back in April, May, that now was not the right time to come back into public office until he had resolved those personal issues?
I assume that, and as I say, I haven't spoken to David, but my assumption would be that David would think that the press wouldn't delve so much into his private life. He is entitled to a private life as a public servant. He is entitled to a private life. The press just wouldn't leave his private life alone.
What's going to happen to him now?
Well, I think it's too early to say what's going to happen to David. As I say, David will take time to sit down, reflect, talk to his friends, talk to his family. All I know is that David has been a fantastic public servant. David will bounce back from this. He is an extremely strong character. David still has, in my opinion, a hell of a lot to offer, and David will continue to do what he can in some form in public life, but it's too early to actually talk about that in any sort of detail.
Well, I'm sure that almost everybody will wish him well in his future career. Harry Halpin, for now, thanks very much indeed.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, let's just give you a quick sample of the hundreds of emails we've had about David Blunkett's resignation. Jeff Buckingham emailed us to say, I'm deeply appalled at the way David Blunkett has yet again been hounded out of office by the media. The UK has lost one of its most able and reforming ministers. But Morris from Northumberland disagrees. Blunkett says that the public and private lives of a politician are completely separate. But if you're in a public life and the public are paying your wages, your private life is public. John Cately says Blunkett should not have resigned. He should have been sacked. And surely now Blair should also resign. And Susan Proctor says he's not fit to be a minister, and as for his daytime TV-style hand-wringing over his private life, pass the sick bag. News at sky.com. Text us if you prefer, 84501, live to Westminster, and a former colleague of Mr Blunkett, the Labour MP, Frank Field. Mr Field, should he have been allowed to have a public and a private life?
No, I think that early email that you read out put it very clearly that while people obviously want private lives, if you behave in your private life in a way which does affect how you are perceived publicly, for example, not abiding by the rules of disclosing or wishing to seek business interests, then clearly private and public do clash. And I think David was right to resign for the reasons he's given, but I also understand why the Prime Minister wanted to keep hold of him, in that he was a person of such stature, and the welfare reforms which we were elected on 8 years ago very largely still need to be tackled.
Do you think the Prime Minister should have sacked him?
No, I don't. And as I said, I do understand why the Prime Minister wished to keep him this is not a black and white issue. Most moral decisions are not made at those extremes. He clearly did break the rules, but what one has to balance against that was his political abilities to try and deliver on the big three areas of welfare reform which are awaiting decision still, and that's on pensions reform. Can the government get the CSA off the floor and to begin to deliver at least a minimal service, largely to mothers but sometimes to fathers, and also this largest group that we've got on benefit, those claiming incapacity benefit, how can we give that very large groups real opportunities when and where they exist to move back into work?
It's a department that's very close to your heart, of course. We're looking at the fourth Secretary of State in a year. What a mess.
Yeah, it clearly isn't. Oscar Wilde says something about losing husbands, didn't they? And it applies with Secretaries of State. What the Prime Minister now has to do is make the decision on who should follow David. And I believe it's important he has somebody either that he can work with very closely like David Miliband, or if not him, one of the real heavyweights in the Cabinet. It's impossible to move the Home Secretary at the moment, but somebody like John Reid does see a life for himself at the top after Mr Blair resigns, which he's announced he's going to do sometime this Parliament. And I think we need somebody of that ability to drive through the reforms on each of these three key areas.
Who's the biggest loser, do you think? Is it the Prime Minister for losing such an able minister? Is it Mr Blunkett, who's obviously no longer going to have a place at the top table, either in this government or in future governments, one would assume? Or is it the people who were relying on this government to sort out invalidity benefit and the other benefits?
The big losers of the country, in that, as I say, we are waiting serious reforms on the Child Support Agency, on incapacity benefit and on pensions. And the eruption today won't actually help bring that day forward and for the government to move forward resolutely but fairly on all three fronts.
OK, Frank Field MP, thanks very much indeed.
Thank you.
Well, let's cross now live to the Department of Work and Pensions, and our correspondent John Craig is standing by for us. Hello to you, John. The former minister is inside again now, I should say the Secretary of State. Do we know what his plans are?
Well, I think that he got back here certainly about 10-15 minutes ago. I guess he's clearing his desk, as ministers do. He arrived back in the red Jaguar that, of course, he's had as one of the perks of being a senior cabinet minister. Some ministers, I have to say, make do with a Vauxhall Omega, not Mr Blunkett. Big question, will he keep some of these perks now he's no longer in government? The Grace and Favour House, he kept it when he wasn't a minister between December and May. My guess is he'll keep the security. You can just about see, you can see the Range Rover there that the security men use. I think there might be some anger if he does keep some of the perks and trappings of office. I don't expect he's going to be very long here in the department, because I guess all he's going to do is say a few goodbyes. You heard at the beginning of his statement over at the Foreign Press Association, he thanked some of his civil servants. Having listened to that, though, and having talked to some MPs the last few minutes, there are a few question marks about some of the things he said in that statement at the Foreign Press Association, particularly Mr Blunkett's account of what happened first thing this morning. Did he jump or was he pushed? His claim that he went to see the Prime Minister very early, around about 8 o'clock, and the Prime Minister urged me to stay, he said. Tony asked me to stay. Then he went back, and a second time it was then that he told the Prime Minister his position was untenable. Well, I've heard different versions from members of Parliament, I can tell you. There are suggestions that Mr Blunkett was in fact told by the Prime Minister to go. He wanted to go and meet the Work and Pensions Select Committee. They cancelled the meeting because they'd been told by number 10 that he'd already quit. So there's still a lot of questions about that. One other name, by the way, Kay, being mentioned as a future Secretary of State for Work and Pensions is the Pensions Minister, Stephen Timms. Now, I'm told by some MPs I've been talking to, if you want somebody who's unflashy, uncontroversial, then Stephen Timms is your man. He's the MP for East Ham. He's an ex-Treasury Minister. He joined this department not very long ago as Pensions Minister after the general election. One MP said to me that he will close the whole thing down. He'll get pensions and incapacity benefit off the front pages in the way that Alistair Darling did with transport when he succeeded Stephen Byers, another minister who quit in embarrassing and humiliating and some might say scandalous circumstances over the burying bad news. Also, I'm told Stephen Timms, of course, is an ex-Treasury Minister who will serve both Prime Ministers. That was an MP's phrase, not mine. A Gordon Brown loyalist as well as a Tony Blair loyalist. So great speculation about Mr Blunkett's successor. At the moment, he's clearing his desk and saying his goodbyes. Whether he will leave in the red Jaguar, I don't suppose he'll be going along here to get the bus, but it's always used to be said that it's very brutal when ministers leave the government. They lose all the perks, the civil service, the car, and all the other trappings. Well, last time Mr Blunkett kept them. We'll see if he leaves in the red Jag.
Yeah, maybe Mr Prescott can lend him one of his. John Craig, for now, thanks very much indeed. Now let's reflect just a moment on the impact on today's resignation on Mr Blair. In the Commons, the Tory leader Michael Howard said the Blunkett controversy proved he was a lame duck Prime Minister.
This has been an extraordinary week for the government and for the Prime Minister. We have seen the slow seepage of his authority turn into a hemorrhage. We all acknowledge the honourable way in which the Secretary of State for Work and Pensions has decided to resign, and I pay tribute to him for that. But the key question now is for the Prime Minister. Does the Prime Minister think that in his handling of this affair, his judgment has been at fault in any way?
Well, let me tell him exactly why I did not believe that the allegations made against my right honourable friend warranted his dismissal. And perhaps with the frenzy that is going on around this, it's just as well for the House and for members of the public just to explain why not. There were basically three sets of allegations, and perhaps I can just be allowed to detail my reasons why I decided not to dismiss them. There were three sets of allegations. One was that he had not sought the advice of the Independent Advisory Committee, which he should have done. That is a breach of the Ministerial Code, it is true. I did not believe that it warranted dismissal for these reasons. First of all, I could discover no impropriety or wrongdoing in his doing that. Secondly, he had actually registered these things. He had registered these jobs with the Register of Members' Interests. It arose out of a misunderstanding on the correspondence, which I looked at myself and believed was an honest misunderstanding on his part, and it was clear to me that even had he been in touch with the advisory committee, as he accepts he should have done, the most that would have happened is that in respect of one of those jobs, his taking up of that job would have been delayed by a few weeks. In those circumstances, I did not believe it warranted his dismissal. The second set of allegations was in respect of the register of shareholdings in DNA Bioscience. He was supposed to follow a particular procedure for ministers when they come into government. He followed that procedure completely. Therefore, I could find no breach of the ministerial code in respect of that. The third and most serious allegations that were made by the shadow leader of the House was that he had had discussions whilst a member of the government and made representations on behalf of this firm that was either had a contract or was trying to get a contract from the Department of Work and Pensions. Had that allegation been true, it most certainly would have been a dismissible offence. I looked into that allegation. I found it to be completely untrue, and therefore it would not have been right in these circumstances for him to resign. That is why I did not dismiss him under the ministerial code.
Well, our political editor Adam Bolton is standing by for us. Hello again, Adam. So the Prime Minister, this is not going to have any fallout as far as his position is concerned?
Oh, clearly it's going to have fallout. Clearly those people who criticise the Prime Minister will say he's been guilty of a misjudgment in bringing back David Blunkett, and now, of course, he's got to find a new minister. I mean, I'm not saying it's not a serious blow. I'm just when we were talking about what Michael Howard said earlier on, I was simply saying that it is a matter of fact that very often when resignations take place, people say this is the beginning and the end of the Prime Minister, and 9 times out of 10 that is not the case. I should, Kay, add one further name to the speculative hat, quite astonishing one really. We've just seen John Reid, the Defence Secretary, go into Downing Street. Now Mr Reid has proved himself to be very versatile in government. I think he's already had 6 cabinet posts. Could he be moving to another department? Well, we only have the evidence that he walked in the door. Of course, those other names are in the frame: Stephen Timms, David Miliband, John Hutton. Alan Johnson apparently has ruled himself out. If, however, Mr. Reid were to move, and I don't think he'd be very pleased, as he likes to joke that he's one of the few straight men who likes men in uniform, and defence, if you like, was his ambition. If he were to move, I think that would be Mr. Blair sending a signal just how important work and pensions is going to be in the coming year or 18 months, and how he really wants a very, very tough Blairite in there, someone frankly not ashamed, if necessary, to fight with the Treasury on some of these issues. So John Reid, it's pure speculation at this stage, but I should report he went in. And just one other point, I think, to clear up on your speculation earlier with John Craig, I would expect that David Blunkett would keep his Jaguar and his security protection. That has been the custom for Home Secretaries and Northern Ireland Secretaries who are deemed to be live terrorist suspects even after they leave office. And of course Sir Edward Heath, the former Prime Minister, kept a official car and security up until he died earlier this year, well into his 80s.
That's certainly my understanding as well, Adam. As far as John Reid's concerned, we all know, of course, what he had to say when he was first offered the health position. Obviously, we can't say that on TV, but how well does he get on with Gordon Brown? Would he be able to transcend both leaders, as it were?
Well, you know, again, it's an easy phrase, isn't it, to talk about two prime ministers. At the moment, what we had was Gordon Brown sitting next to Tony Blair at Prime Minister's Question Time today. I think whoever gets into the work and pensions job, because so clearly it relates to large portions of taxpayers' cash going back out to people in the form of welfare payments, and because so clearly managing the accounts to make sure there's enough money to pay for pensions in future impinges on the Treasury. Whoever takes that job will have to be able to argue his corner very firmly indeed.
Listening to that news conference earlier, Adam, the journalists that were asking questions, they did everything but say, actually, we don't believe you, we think that you were sacked. What should we make of all that?
Well, what we should make of it is what the Prime Minister and David Blunkett have put on the record. The Prime Minister said in the House of Commons that he was willing to support Mr. Blunkett, and it was Mr. Blunkett's decision to go. Now, of course, were a different version of events to emerge, then the Prime Minister would potentially be guilty of misleading the House of Commons. So the stakes are very high here indeed. And so far, Mr. Blunkett is backing the Prime Minister's version of events. I was struck, Kay, I don't know about you, how very different Mr. Blunkett's resignation was today from his previous resignation as Home Secretary last December. Then there was a great deal of emotion, tears, cracking voices. This time round, it seemed pretty clear that what was said both in the House of Commons and by Mr. Blunkett was cool, calm, collected, unemotional, perhaps with that simmering anger against the media underneath what both Mr. Blunkett and Mr. Blair said.
Yeah, certainly some simmering anger there. What do you think might happen to him, Adam? Presumably he could never come back to a third term in high office.
I think it'd be very unlikely. I think it's inconceivable that Tony Blair could bring him back. Possibly the next Prime Minister, who knows, Gordon Brown, might decide that he wanted to bring David Blunkett back. However, I have to say, if I was giving David Blunkett career advice, it would be to lie low, to consult in future with the committee, and to pursue senior posts, which I'm sure will be on offer, but away from the hothouse of Cabinet government.
Talking to Frank Field MP a little bit earlier on, obviously, as you know, Adam, he was involved with work and pensions, but left his position some years ago now. It is a very, very difficult position to have. It's a poison chalice, some might suggest, perhaps. What sort of person do you think they will need to give that job to?
They need to give it to someone who is highly competent, can deal with figures and complex briefs, But in particular, and this is unusual really for work and pensions, at the moment with these big pensions questions coming up, with these big issues about curtailing invalidity benefit coming up, they need to give it to someone who is a good communicator, who is trusted by the public, and who can make quite hard things in terms of really affecting the real incomes of people less well off in our society, can make those quite hard things seem reasonable.
Certainly deflecting political interest from what's going on as far as the Conservative leadership is concerned. Is that a good thing or a bad thing as far as the two would-be leaders are concerned?
Well, I think we can see that both David Cameron and David Davis decided to stay out of this. None of them have been grandstanding on the issue, though David Davis did say at the weekend that if Mr Blunkett had broken the ministerial code, he should go. And of course, he was speaking as a former minister in the last government. David Cameron, again today, has said that he thinks Mr Blunkett's done the right thing, but expressed a lot of personal sympathy and admiration for him. Until today, Michael Howard had not weighed into this. And I think what that tells us is the Conservatives felt that frankly Mr Blunkett and Mr Blair were probably doing quite enough damage to themselves with the assistance of more junior members of the Conservative front bench and of course the media without needing them to intrude. And I do think we can see that as far as the Conservative leadership is concerned, the Tories see a moment where they can communicate themselves positively, and therefore they haven't been leaping on the chance to stick the knives into the